Sorry, it looks like there was an issue with my audio. I just said thank you so much for joining. My name is Intira. I'm a team member at Simply Neuroscience. I also have Chinmayi and Ria here with me today. Ria, I think we're good to start, so whenever you're ready.
Okay, so thank you for coming today. We're going to host Spatika, who graduated from Indian Institute of Science, Education, and Research, Moli, in 2022 with a BSMS degree in Biological Sciences. As of September 2022, she'll be joining the graduate program in neuroscience at the University of Oxford as a Felix Scholar. Spatika completed her master's thesis on learning and memory formation at the Center of Neuroscience, Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore. Her research was presented at the British Neuroscience Association's members meeting this year. Her earlier research on assessing resting state function connectivity in schizophrenia patients at the National Institute of Mental Health and Neurosciences was presented at the Science Undergraduate Research Conference 2019 in India. She received the GE Star Scholarship from the Institute of International Education and the General Electric Foundation, and the Inspire Fellowship from the Department of Science and Technology, Government of India in 2017. Aside from neuroscience, Spatika co-founded Adventure Science magazine, a science communication initiative between 10 of India's National Institutes for Science, currently in its third edition. We ask that today we have an interactive event, meaning that you guys can open your cameras if you feel comfortable being recorded and unmute yourself and ask questions directly. However, you don't feel like doing so, you can put your questions in the chat and one of us can read it out loud. Thank you for joining us today, Spatika.
Hi, can you hear me now? Yeah, thanks a lot. Great, so thank you so much for having me, Chinmayi, Intira, and Ria. So shall I just go ahead and start sharing my screen?
Yeah, that's perfect.
Great, okay. Can you see my screen?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So hi everyone, I'm Spatika, and today I'm going to be speaking about the options that you have in neuroscience after finishing an undergraduate degree. And I've titled it The Road Not Taken, considering that not very many people ventured on this path. I just finished my bachelor's and master's degree in biology from the Indian Institute of Science, Education and Research. And I will be joining the graduate program in neuroscience at Oxford as of September this year, as Ria already mentioned. So I'm hoping to keep today's session really interactive, and I will keep stopping in between if you guys have questions to ask, because I'd much rather prefer it be a conversation. And I'm hoping I can take you through a couple of things that helped me put together my choices after undergraduate study, as well as a couple of things that I hoped I had a little earlier on the way. So yeah, so I thought to begin, I would, okay, I'm unable to move. Okay, great. Yeah, so I wanted to tell you a little bit about how I entered neuroscience myself. So I was always of the opinion that we're mostly the product of our brains. Everything that we do and everything that we experience and perceive in the world as it is. But I actually came across neuroscience from a very different angle. As someone who's trained in music, I came across studies on the effects of music on Parkinson's disease, which is what really stimulated my interest in the field, particularly when I had the opportunity to observe it in real time with a patient and see its impacts on changing their symptoms, which is what led me down the route to really understand where I could find my place within this domain. Because as we all know, neuroscience is really broad and it's full of possibilities in different directions. So in my undergraduate years, I did a couple of different things in neuroscience itself. So I'm very interested in different types of topics. So beyond the biological aspect of the brain as such, I'm also interested in understanding how arts and the brain are connected to each other, particularly in the sense of reward, considering how important this is in understanding the arts. And I also worked in a project studying brain imaging and schizophrenia. And aside from that, my interests also lie in understanding how neuroscience and psychology manifest in English and other forms of literature. And I've actually found different resources in the arena of both the arts as well as the sciences that integrate into this field. And finally, for my master's thesis, I actually studied learning and memory formation in worms, which sounds very different. But the thing about the species I used, which is called Caenorhabditis elegans, is that it's a nematode species with only 302 neurons in its system, which makes it a really great model for us to study the brain as it is in humans, because we can understand it through a much more simplistic lens. So I've just finished this thesis, and I'm looking into progressing towards the field of systems neuroscience. But today, I will be talking a bit about how I came here, because when I first joined my undergraduate program, I was interested in all types of neuroscience. So I think what I would recommend that anybody do is use these years to sort of find their niche. So I'm not exactly sure how many students here are undergraduates and how many have already passed out, but I will speak a little bit about what you can do during your undergraduate years before we go on to applying to grad school. So I would always recommend exploration over a set routine. And that's simply because I think that these years are never going to come back. And this is the best time for you to really find different types of things and get involved in different things, because that really allows you to diversify. And by different things, I don't necessarily mean different types of lab rotations or different, academic fields. It could be anything, because the thing about neuroscience is that it can be approached from anywhere. It's also something very unrestricted by majors and minors, because I've seen people with all sorts of educational backgrounds contribute to this field. And the way it has evolved, it also accepts people from non-scientific backgrounds to and allows them to train themselves in a manner that they can contribute to it effectively. So really use your undergraduate years to explore different aspects, whether it's in one of your own hobbies or it's in some academic classes you're taking, because that would really, really let you find and hone in on what you're best at. So in this aspect, I would recommend striking a balance between your laboratory experience and computational aspects of research. Both of these are very vital for understanding the brain. And there are, of course, studies and, groups that work solely on, the laboratory experience, whereas there are groups that only conduct computational analyses. And if you've managed to secure those opportunities, that's also great. But if you're still unsure and you're trying to find your way through the process, then it's always great if you've picked up some skills from each of these things. That having a diverse application is always, always good. And another thing that you can do, and this is not just restricted to your undergraduate years, but in general, even as you go through, is to network with student groups and local societies. So in my final year of my undergraduate study, I was able to join the British Neuroscience Association. And that's really been very helpful for introducing me to various types of opportunities in neuroscience. And beyond that, there are lots of groups that, like Simply Neuroscience, have emerged, which are completely student-led. And there is a lot of there's a lot of advantage to staying in a student limited community, because you have a lot of people who understand where you're coming from, who are in the network, and they know what the current developments are, and they can connect you to the people that you need to speak to. Let's say you're approaching a lab and you'd like to speak out to some supervisors, but before that, you'd like to learn about the lab from their graduate students. So student networks, their importance cannot be overstated. So the best way, of course, to gain any sort of experience is through your summer internships, which I'm sure many of you might already be doing. And these are great, either whether they're through programs or through your independent applications. I often know that people focus on getting into specific types of internships, but what I've noticed is that as long as you manage to secure something and you're putting your best into it, you're still going to learn a significant skill set that you can carry forward anywhere else. And another good thing about internships is that it connects you to faculty advisors and seniors, and they are probably going to be your best point of contact before you can make an informed decision about where you'd like to contribute and what sort of fields you can really improve. So other things that I personally would recommend doing, but are not always recommended, include outreach and other activities, which could be anything from music to sports to dance to things like that, because I've often felt that the most fascinating things that you learn about the brain is probably by doing things outside of just brain research. And outreach initiatives are one of the best ways to really get out there, because for everyone who's attending this, you've already been able to benefit really well from so many of the events that the organization has conducted in the last couple of days. So participating in these is always great because it allows you to sit in the driver's seat and coordinate activities and conceptualize them. And a lot of science is really also getting out what you're doing to someone else, and not just, learning how to present them to a niche audience within a closed conference room. And over this process, using all the things that I've mentioned here, the ultimate goal is going to be to identify the skills you'd like to build. I want to be better at this particular molecular technique. I want to be better at reviewing literature. I want to be better at coding through this so that I can extract this sort of information from this program. They're all specific skills, and they're only built when you diversify and identify projects that allow you to build them. And there's only so much that you can get from sitting inside a classroom or studying a textbook. So having said all of that, I would like to emphasize that what you do in your undergraduate years is not a make or break decision for graduate school. There are people from all sorts of backgrounds who manage to enter neuroscience, and that's because everybody just believes that they have a good skill set to contribute. And graduate school is meant to prepare you for the rest of the way. So the amount of training you need before graduate school is really sometimes not as important as the fact that you just learn during your undergraduate years. So so I found a really great article on being an underrepresented STEM undergraduate, but the reason why I'm showing it to you today is whether you're underrepresented or not, the tenets here are really, really useful. So over your undergraduate years, and perhaps also as you prepare for applying for graduate school, or as you prepare for applying for the next step, there are some crucial things that you need to follow and that you can identify which are just determined by your consistency. I'm sure many people would have told you that going on ahead, graduate school is hard, that there are factors that are determined by luck, there are factors that are determined by connections, but the couple of things that you see here are things that you can consistently build up. So starting with the 3 what questions, namely identify what your passions are, your academic interests, and the impact that you can make. So you may be passionate about something, you may not be learning that in your classes, but you may be learning something else which you can tie into your passions. And tying those two together will allow you to understand what sort of an impact you can make. And by impact, I don't mean something, long-term, big scale, because you're all 17 to 20 years of age. But even on a small scale, why do you think you should be studying that? Why do you think you want to study that organ? Or why do you think you want to study that cell and its firing? Things like that. And once you've managed to put these things together, you always have to know that anything that we do in science is based on critical thinking. Namely, is this the best way to approach this problem? Regardless of whether you've just started to work in a laboratory environment or whether you are an experienced person, this habit of constantly questioning what is at hand is really useful to develop as you proceed towards your graduate school. Another great thing that can set you apart is being active beyond science and locating skill building opportunities like scientific writing, presentation, using specific softwares. These are all things that will collate and help you as you apply, as well as give you an edge over others when you finally reach graduate school or when you've decided to do the things that you want to do after your college. And finally, one of the best things that you can do is in your preparation is to assess social communities within and beyond research groups. It's obviously important for you to know what your research group is going to be like, what your supervisor may be like. But beyond that, there are also social communities. There are engagements that are extracurricular. And all of these are really, really useful in building you and honing you as a person. As I said, you always can find interesting things that the brain is capable of doing beyond just firing a bunch of signals and getting you out of bed every day. And I think that the best way to find these out is by involving yourself in them. So these things have been listed here simply because these are things that are within your control. These are aspects that will help prepare you as you apply. And these are things that you can build on yourself. They're not things that will disappear. They're not binary. They're things that will get better only as you keep practicing them over and over again. So I've included some links, and I'll share it with you at the end, but this article is really useful for anybody who's interested in applying for graduate school. And it also contains a lot of information on how you can fund yourself, how you can find opportunities. So I'm sure you've all found research scholarships or heard of awards and things like that, as well as summer and field assistantships. And these are things that I'm sure many of you are already doing. But beyond that, in graduate school, there are opportunities for teaching assistantships and work study programs. And this paper contains really nice information on that. I will not go too much into the details of that because that's restricted a little bit to graduate study. But learning how to teach or learning how to communicate in your undergraduate years is probably the best thing that you can do, because it means you know how to break down your research or your understanding to an audience that need not necessarily have a background in that, which is what most of us do in neuroscience when we first start. So yeah, I will now get to the main part, which is what the topic was about, beyond undergraduate study. If anybody has any questions about what we've discussed till now, I can just stop here. You can let me know. Yeah, someone has raised their hand.
Yeah, Camille, I hope I'm saying you're right. You can go, your name right. I hope you can go ahead and ask your question. Okay, 2 hands. We can have Camille and then Ritik.
They're not allowed to unmute. Maybe you could unmute.
I'm not too sure why. Let me just check that out. In the meantime, if you can type the question in the chat box for now, that would be helpful.
Hi. I was wondering if it felt pretty overwhelming to find what you, or actually how did you manage like feeling overwhelmed during finding your undergraduate exploration? did you just like take it time by time and just figured out what you like? How did that all work? Because it seems like a lot of like what you're saying is a lot and kind of overwhelming.
So me personally, I did my undergraduate in India, and yeah, that's a great question. I'm sure I felt overwhelmed lots of times because I think by the end of my second year of study, I had honed in on what I wanted to work on. And after that, COVID struck, and it sort of made everything worse because all these labs started shutting down, and I couldn't go ahead and get these hands-on skills that everybody was raving about. But I think it's very normal to feel overwhelmed. And that's why I was really hoping I wouldn't throw too much information at you in this talk, because the talk itself can be overwhelming. But also the fact that if you do feel overwhelmed, I think it's best to just take a step back and do something else, because that's always been helpful. I mean, I don't necessarily approach neuroscience from only an internship or an academic perspective. Sometimes if it's getting too much, I would probably branch off, do something else. Okay, go write for some time, or, do something completely different that's activating a totally different part of your head, and then come back to it and see what your prospects are. Because today everything has become really that competitive, which is why, and the information is flooded with the internet is flooded with information. So it's very natural for it to get overwhelming, but I think the best thing you can do sometimes is just take a step back and wait, and then get back to it when you feel you're a little clearer about what you're doing. You just have to not take on too many things at the same time, because that was one thing I did very often. And sometimes it's best to let go of a couple of things and really figure out what needs your attention. I don't know if that answered it, but yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, Ritik has...
Moving on to Ritik's question. Ritik, if you prefer unmuting and asking your question, it should work now. If not, we can just read it from the chat.
Yeah, I can. My question is that in the undergraduate, how do we pursue individual research when there are not many opportunities to do so? And how do we go about just being a major contributor in that publishing that research paper, and while being in the undergraduate? I'm currently in my third semester, and my program consists of neurophysiology. It has a majority of EEG, EMG, nerve conduction studies, sleep studies, evoke potential, and these kind of things, right? Or in my program. So how do I go about gathering research skills, or how do I exactly start? Because my research course in my university it's in a year later from now. So how do I start it on my own? I don't have to wait for the university to offer that course in a particular semester. So how do I go about it?
Right. Can you tell me where you're studying?
I'm studying
in India?
Karachi, Pakistan.
Oh, okay. It's in Pakistan. Okay.
Yeah.
Do you have summer breaks, or do you not have them?
We have, but this time is I am only a week away from my third semester's final. So then we'll have clinical rotations, right? Not all day long for now, but
Okay.
that will include hospital rotations. We work with the patients and in the lab, EEG labs, and we see how the brain machines, these scanning machines work, right? Really. So in all that mess, how do I go about being a good researcher, just while being undergraduate?
Okay, so if you don't have any time beyond your semester work, then it's probably a little hard for you to get in time to do research, because even if I tell you that you can do it on the side, how much time would you really be able to devote to it, and what will you really get out of it? Those are the main questions you'll have to ask. So if you don't have any free time, like you don't have a month's break or a 2-month break before your research semester starts, you probably have to wait until then. But if you are interested in something, then you can always start by reading up on it beforehand, planning out where you'd like to, do your research project. You can always read up on literature and reach out to people who are working in the field that you want to study in, because you're still developing your knowledge of the field, even if you're not doing any hands-on work at the time. But of course, if you have any sort of free time and you're interested, then you should definitely go ahead and start. But like I said, I would not recommend doing it alongside your courses, because usually people don't have enough time. And also you're only in your third semester, so trust me, you have plenty of time. A lot of people start much later.
Can I also add one more thing to it? I read it from Quora that it said that even the first month of your first semester of your undergraduate is not too early to start your research. So that was maybe a bit of an exaggeration. I'm not really sure.
Yeah.
So I'm really interested to know what's your narrative on this particular thing.
I'm not for that narrative. I think that's a bit overkill. I think the first month of your undergraduate is when you've just gotten out of school and you're literally left in this world of possibilities right after you've been taken out of a very protective environment. So I know people who may have started research in their first month, but it's not like people who didn't do it are at a disadvantage. I didn't start in the first month. Although if you are interested, then looking up internship programs is a really great way for you to go ahead, because preparing for that beforehand would be great. I mean, if you're looking to apply to a summer internship abroad or in India, in your country of research, then you can still prepare your application materials. You can identify groups you'd like to work with. And there are a lot of other initiatives in-house that you can identify within your institute where you may be able to work while doing your semester coursework as well. I don't think you are at a disadvantage if you haven't started immediately after you join.
Just one more short question, ma'am. If I am not really taking too much time. See, my program is mostly of like more of a practical neurosciences, rather than just theoretical neurosciences. I think your program would be, right?
My program was biology, so it's that's fine. Go ahead.
All right. See, yeah. So I was into my program is mostly like practical, right? So how do I make it more theoretical? Just applying for a master's, which is like fully research based and in the core neurosciences, in the main type of neurosciences, not just a neurophysiology that which I am doing right now.
So you want to switch to a genetic neuroscience degree? Is that what you're saying?
Or maybe molecular neuroscience and main hardcore neurosciences rather than just the neurophysiology aspect of the whole neuroscience in total.
Yeah, but you're talking about applying for that after your undergraduate?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm not exactly aware of the opportunities in Pakistan, but I do know that there are a couple of institutes in India that offer master's degrees in general neurosciences, which you mentioned. And I also know that there are lots of really good master's degrees in neuroscience offered in Europe. And also there are a couple of them, they're called MPhils, which are offered in the UK. And the only downside to these is that once you start applying abroad, there's the question of funding, because master's degrees are not very well funded. But having said that, if you're really interested, then I would recommend that you start looking into the programs that you're interested in and gathering what you need to apply to those places.
Thank you so much.
Great. I'll just go ahead and take questions later on. So so the first question that you need to ask yourself is whether you want to do a PhD. So if you do want to do a PhD, then I'm going to assume you want to do a PhD and speak about the next couple of things. But I will also talk about how you can do research assistantships after your undergraduate degree is over if you want to get some hands-on experience before graduate study. So there are early scholarships that open in June and July. A couple of these, like the Knight Hennessy at Stanford and Rhodes, are things that are, they're more on the rare side because not everything opens at this time. But typically, graduate programs in the US and UK are open through September and to December. And in Europe, it's also quite variable because they remain open until February. Another thing about Europe is that you can often apply directly to do a project with an individual supervisor. So you can just go through an advertised position and you don't need to root through the entire program. And these positions can be advertised at any time in the year. So Having said that, another aspect about Europe is that there are many positions for master's thesis projects and summer projects that are also advertised on university websites. So if you look into any of the Max Planck Institutes or any other institutes in Germany, particularly, you will see that a lot of supervisors include descriptions of master's projects. And you can do these while being enrolled at an institute in your country just to complete your degree. Of course, your institute has to allow that. So yeah, so the first thing that you want to do is to make a list of professors from across institutes. This doesn't mean that you need to know what you're going to do in your PhD. It really doesn't mean that. Typically, if you've done a master's degree or a master's project, you will have a really much better idea of what you would like to and don't like to work on. Based on that, you can narrow down professors from different institutes and look into their research profiles and what they have managed to publish. So you will also, if you are an international student, you'll also have to look into giving exams. So TOEFL and other English communication exams are probably mandatory if you belong to certain countries like India. But GRE today is actually becoming quite optional for institutes in the US. So it's really recommended that you look into their program. Or for instance, if you're looking at the neuroscience program, make sure they ask specifically for the GRE. Otherwise, I would not recommend writing it. So the way in which you find PIs is really diverse because there's a whole list of them from across so many institutes. So the first thing you'd probably do is research your field and what publications or studies have been established. And I don't expect people to be able to understand an entire paper, but you get a feeling for what the person has done in the study just by reading the abstract. And apart from that, Twitter is really a great way to find PIs. So if you have a Twitter account and know how to operate it, then you know that you can search for your field of interest, your model organism of interest, or even Googling specific, even searching for specific keywords that are relevant to neuroscience within the Twitter search field will connect you to a lot of PIs. And once you start following a couple of PIs, you will get into the network to see who their colleagues are. And that's a really great way to find positions as well, because a lot of people advertise positions on Twitter. Another point is that you can ask your current academic supervisors to recommend PIs for you. If you know them well enough, then you can ask them to even send in a line recommending you so you can discuss a possible graduate opportunity with them. And especially in Europe, as I mentioned, university websites advertise positions. And in Europe, these are really flexible in time. They don't necessarily close by December. So once you've found PIs that you're interested in, it's recommended you reach out to them. Of course, in the US, most things are through a standardized program, so it's not as common, but in Europe, especially, reaching out is the best way to go ahead. And when you do write to them, make sure you write a formal email with your CV and your academic transcript and a cover letter included. So your cover letter is probably the most important part of this. You'll have to keep it very brief and also highlight the most important things, which are what your educational background is, what skills you have acquired until now, either through your coursework or through your internship training, and how those skills are relevant for their lab environment and what ideas you can incorporate there. If you manage to connect these things together, then you have a much better chance of communicating things to a supervisor. Of course, it's very, very likely they may not respond because that's the problem with cold emails. But nevertheless, you can always send a reminder about 1 to 2 weeks later to reach out to them. It's always good to do this, even if it's a US university, because it's always nice because suppose someone by chance sees your name and they remember it, it doesn't harm anyone. So So this is a really useful guide for how to find PhD programs that work for you. I've only included this slide because I think it's important for everyone here to understand, but I'll include the link to the guide, which was developed by someone at the Harvard Medical School. And this particular slide compares programs in the US and Europe. So the US programs are typically inbuilt with a master's degree in the sense that they have a lot of coursework in the beginning, but in Europe, it's not the same. You just jump straight into your project. And because of that, in Europe, your project runs for a fixed period of time, which is usually 3 to 4 years, and you have to complete in that time, or else your funding can run out. But that problem is not there in the US because you have a much longer period to complete your PhD. And you, as I said, you generally apply to programs in the US, whereas in Europe, you can apply to individual labs and you don't end up doing rotations. So yeah, I'll include the link to this. This has a lot of really good information if you're interested, but as I said, you can get an overload of information if you keep going through these things. So after you've managed to reach out to a PI, there is a matter of what you'd like to discuss with them. So as I said, if you've managed to reach out and someone responds positively, they can set up a meeting with you, especially now that online meetings have become so commonplace. And the best thing to do is discuss how well your interests match. But beyond this, you also get an understanding for what the PI does, what their goals are for graduate students, how they are as a PI, and what they envision doing in their future. So when I reached out to PIs and the ones who responded to me, they did something similar on this line. And the best thing that they did was connect me to their current graduate students, because then I could get a very good idea of what they are like outside of the formal environment. Because it's at this point that you want to know what this person is like, how good they are, at mentorship, how often do they meet with students, and also how likely are they to recommend you for future programs. So once you're done with this is the time that you'll be contacting referees who will probably be your internship supervisors or your teachers. And when you apply finally, after you get all your materials together, one really good thing that students can do is apply across programs. So when I was applying to when I was applying to a specific university, I don't remember which one, it had a provision for you to apply to multiple programs for the same application fee. So you need not only apply to neuroscience, you could apply to psychological sciences, you could apply to biomedical, whichever you think you can have a really good shot at. And as long as you don't have to pay an extra fee for that, this is always a good idea. So this is just a summary of the timeline that you would probably be looking at. So around next month, you can find programs and PIs, and if there are any early scholarships. And between September to November is when you can contact advisors. As I said, it's not necessary they may respond, which is why you'll have to contact multiple advisors, but make sure you don't do too many of them in the same department. Around October, you can contact your referees and write your statement of purpose, which I'll go over in the next couple of slides. And in November, it's probably time for you to submit the application. So having said all of this, I would like to say that most of us don't realize it until it's happening. It's really great if you have a plan like this and you are aware of these things, but I missed a lot of deadlines because I started my application process around early October. So, which is why I've put this timeline here. But having said that, it's okay if you don't start on time. You can still pick up from wherever you've left. Yeah, so I'm just going to go on and go over the aspects of statement of purpose. Should I go over some question? Inshira, can you just... I'm not able to access the chat.
Yeah, sure. So we had a question from Michaela asking how to achieve funded internships around the world.
Okay, so I'm going to include a list of summer internships that you can access, which are mostly funded. These are all programs that I've included in the list. I'll share it with you guys at the end. But if you are reaching out to a supervisor, typically, especially if you're reaching out to someone abroad, typically if they're willing to have you over, they will be willing to offer funding. But again, this is a less likely possibility. So, but I do have a list of funded internship programs that I'll share.
And then Ritik's asked, why should we not go for non-GRE requiring universities in the USA?
I didn't say that. Did I say that?
No,
I just said that you should look into whether university requires GRE. And I said, don't write the GRE if all the universities you want to apply to are not asking for it. Because honestly, right now it's even become optional for some universities. At least in neuroscience, maybe other fields require the GRE. It's just very expensive.
Okay, Christina's just asked, how did you decide that you wanted to do a PhD?
I don't know. I genuinely don't know the answer to that. But I think I wanted to do a PhD because I knew I wanted to study the brain. I knew I did not want to become a medical doctor. And I wanted to do hardcore scientific research. But after that, I noticed that a lot of times in the life sciences, a master's degree is not enough. You really don't learn enough if you want to seriously take up research, and at least in the life sciences, which is why I did a PhD. I wanted to do a PhD, but I think a lot of the reason why many people want to do it is because they're surrounded by people who are discussing it. So I spent my life in a science institute. So most people there went on to do a PhD. But yeah, I mean, if you want to study something like brain sciences, I think it's unlikely a master's will be enough.
All right, I've got a question. What do you think was the most valuable non-academic activity you did as an undergrad?
Most valuable in terms of how it helped me for graduate study, or?
I guess so, yeah.
Okay. I think probably all the science outreach events I did, because I was interacting with a lot of people from non-biology, non-neuroscience backgrounds, and I had to really break down my understanding of the field to them. So I organized science outreach events in my institute, and I also worked on a science communication initiative with students from across the country. And I also, there's also an interesting organization called Science Gallery, and they work at the nexus of arts and sciences. And they recently conducted an exhibition explaining artistic exhibits about the brain. So that was probably very interesting because all these things allowed me to develop my understanding of the field, but also learn how to communicate it effectively.
All right, thanks.
So you mentioned the timeline, right, for graduate admission stuff. I just wanted to check, when do you think is an optimal time to start searching? So, for example, for me, I'm on a 3-year undergraduate course and I've just finished my first year. And I'm sure I want to go on to graduate studies. So when do you think would be a good time to start researching options and weighing out what I can do next?
I think most people start in their final year of study. So if you start around July or August of your final year, I think you're pretty good. At least that's what I managed to do. But I'm pretty sure you'll encounter a lot of opportunities as you get through the next year. So by the time your final year starts, you'll be in a little better position to decide.
Okay, great. Thank you.
iPhone has asked if there are any neuro book recommendations. Let me think. If you're referring to textbooks, then I think you'll find a bunch of them online. There are pretty classic books, Dale Purves, all of those things. But if you're referring to books outside of that, then there are some really good writers in neuroscience: Oliver Sacks, David Eagleman. Then there's also a professor at Chapman University in California called Richard Ruppel, and he studies a cognitive approach to reading literature. So those are the things coming off the top of my head. But if I can think of more, I will let you know. I'll share my contact at the end of the presentation so you can write back to me about it. Okay, so I'll go ahead. So the statement of purpose is probably the biggest thing that you'll need for your graduate applications. And it's just good practice, even if you're not applying immediately. So I found this template on a website called Structure is Magic. And structure is really magic because I saw a lot of samples here that I think would be useful to anybody who's interested in applying. And the way the statement is supposed to really emerge is, you have your introduction about yourself, but the introduction is also something that has to catch someone's eye as a reader. So you want to avoid using cliched introductory statements like, I once saw a video of all the things not to say on a statement of purpose. And I remember there were some very funny things that people started saying, like, from when I was a child, I always liked watching movies. And this professor read it and said, well, who doesn't? Things like that. You don't want to stick to cliched things, and you also don't want to go overboard and say things like, I've wanted to research the neuronal basis of molecular disorders since when I was in middle school. So keep it honest, but also make sure you bring out, the most significant parts of what you've been doing, which need not necessarily be achievements. They're just things that significantly define you. So once you get over the introduction, the main things you focus on are why this program at this school and why you should be in this school. And all of these things are tied by what drives you to study neuroscience and what has driven you in the past. So if you look into it, basically, the way in which this would work is, I would suggest you sort of jot down all your previous experiences in paragraphs and then tie it into a story. So just make a list of all the things that you've done, the things that you think are significant, and the things that define you. As I said, it does not necessarily mean I have 10 publications or I worked with this Nobel Prize winning scientist. It could just be something where you learned something new, because that's what they're looking for. They're looking for someone who knows how to consistently hit at a problem and not stop just because you're not getting the answer that you wanted. So you can, the best thing to do is also look into your university's professors and find people you'd like to work with. And it's really great if you can write their names in your statement, if it's relevant, so that you've already identified some fields you'd like to work in and what you can contribute to it. So the basic, the overall implication is you're relating your research to some larger goal at hand. It isn't just identifying what this tiny molecule can do here or what this code can get out of that. It's seeing a bigger picture, and which does not, again, have to be, I'm going to cure cancer, but it is seeing what you can do over a much broader scale, which is where the communication part becomes important. Because even though you have to be specific in your statement, it also has to be accessible to a broad group of people who are all academic administrators. So one thing I'd also recommend is to avoid generalizing between programs, because they can catch it pretty easily. And also because it's always useful if you hone in on specifically what is good about that university or this school, which is not there elsewhere, and why it's good for you, because you're bringing the skill set and you're developing on that skill set through their program. So that's definitely something to keep in mind. And finally, the topic of extenuating circumstances is something, but of course it's optional. So what I mean by extenuating circumstances are things that, so I first came across this while applying to graduate school, I don't remember where, somewhere in Europe. And they had a section where they recommended writing about any sort of disruptions that happened specifically because of COVID. And I know that a lot of you may have started your undergrad during the process, but for people who are in their senior years of undergrad, you probably had a disruption through your degree. So if you've managed to make the best out of that, or if you've managed to make anything out of it, it really doesn't hurt to put it in. This is the one place where you get to boast about yourself. So you can definitely consider that, because I'm sure people on the other side are sensitive to the fact that a lot of people's education has been disrupted by this. So overall, to summarize what I've been saying, this is a rubric that I used. I found Dr. ABC's work on X very interesting because of so and so reason, and connected to your previous experience working on, I don't know, some sort of project or some sort of course. And finally, you use these two things as a reason for why you can undertake some other thing within their supervision, within their network. I can therefore help contribute to these things because I had skills in those and because I'm interested in the rest of these things. So this is a sample statement, and I really thought I should show it to you guys because it was a really good statement I saw on neuroscience. So this is how she's introduced herself. When I ended my career with the California Ballet, I looked forward to an academic experience studying the metabolic and neurological systems which had governed my physical reality as a performer. It's very wordy, I agree, but the thing that you have to take away from this is that she's connected her experience completely unrelated to neuroscience to where her interests grew in the field and what her interests currently are. So, and then she uses it as a segue to go on to the next sentence, which is how she entered her undergraduate curriculum and how her interests developed. Another good thing about this is how she highlights the specific things she did. For instance, having averaged 25 research hours per week. So in this way, you've conveyed specifics of what you've done in the past. You can also replace it by saying the names of specific techniques and why that relates to something you want to study for your graduate course. I led this developmental subdivision at the lab. Things like these can really highlight what you've done and the skills that you bring. And this work has led to me identifying a unique obese phenotype. So you see, this is not something that's a huge accomplishment, right? It's something that's really practical and something that's restricted to her research. You need not necessarily have some sort of a fancy award to brag about, but you can just have done consistent research, which is why I spoke earlier about those things that we need to maintain, because those are things that will just take you a long way, regardless of what sort of luck, blows and all of that. So I will, before we go on to this, I can take more questions.
Yeah, I think a couple have come in the chat. So the first one is, do you read research papers in your free time? How do you start reading research papers outside of school? And how do you find the right topics to start for someone who just graduated high school? Do you have any tips to keep up with the research trend in neuroscience?
Okay, let me see this. Okay, have you read any research papers in your free time? Okay. So I sort of need to read research papers for my thesis. So I don't like to read them even in my free time. But you mentioned you are just graduating high school, I think. Yeah. Okay. So if you're graduating high school, sure, read research papers. There's only, try your best to understand them, but there's no pressure if you can't, because even people who are very well read often don't understand papers and they go into a rabbit hole. But one really good thing I had during my undergraduate was that I had the opportunity to structure literature reviews and proposals, which required me to read a lot of research papers. So even if you don't do it right now, I'm sure you'll find opportunities to do it as you go through your undergrad. How do you start reading research papers? So I think the first thing would be to find what you'd like to study, even if it's neuroscience. Maybe start with scientific communication articles rather than hardcore papers. So you can look up simple magazines like Science, AAAS, Scientific American. All of these are things that communicate a lot of research in a really sophisticated way, but it's still accessible. And if you've managed to get through those, then maybe go on to an actual research paper. Keep up with the research trend. Yeah, I think just keeping up with these outlets is great because these outlets keep updating themselves. There's also a website called The Scientist, which is really good if you want to do any sort of life sciences research. I hope that answered your question. Is there another question? Yeah.
I think we have one more question in the chat that says, has your study of neuroscience influenced your perspective on everyday life in any way? And if so, how?
Yeah, definitely. It's definitely influenced a lot of things because, as I said, I entered this field from listening to the impacts that music can have on someone suffering from a neurodegenerative disorder. So I really did not enter it the conventional way. So But having said that, I learned a lot, not just by reading, research papers, but also by reading books. I think there's an author called David Eagleman who's written a book called The Brain. He's written a lot of books, but in that particular book, I think one of the things that influenced me the most was when he listed these studies of how people develop. He listed a couple of studies on how on imaging brains of people after to study the reactions to genocide. So he wanted to look, the people who did the study were looking at how people are completely indifferent to reactions when you look historically at any sort of genocide. Why are neighbors willing to, give up their friends with whom they have spent years in? And very interestingly, they found that the medial prefrontal cortex is a region which is responsible for this feeling of empathy. And the normal empathy that you feel for a neighbor is diminished in people who are sort of, indoctrinated through these processes. And once it's diminished, you start comparing that person to an object, which is why on an internal level, your entire empathy is gone. And I think it was really fascinating that you could bring something on such a behavioral scale down to something happening in your brain. So I think the best way to know if it's influencing your perspective is to read responsible science books. I mean, not any sort of science, but things that convey it responsibly. It's called The Brain. Yeah. Is there another question or?
Yeah, so Ritik says, how do you not get overwhelmed while reading research papers because we haven't reached that academic level as yet?
Yeah, that's the point. You haven't reached that academic level, so it's completely okay if you don't understand it. So there is actually no reason for anyone to be pressurized to do these things before you're ready to do it. I still find it really hard to understand a lot of things in research papers, and I have to go and read up on their individual meanings to, completely put them together, because papers are not meant to be understood by young undergraduates. They're meant to be understood by people who are sitting in that niche, which is why it takes years before you even acquire the practice on your own. But if you are feeling overwhelmed, then I'd recommend starting off with something simpler, like a science communication article, and then trying to look into an actual research paper. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead. So as I said, if you don't know if you want to do a PhD, or if things are, if you're just unsure, research assistantships are also an option. And I'm speaking specifically about this, but there are other things as well. Like I'm sure a lot of people I know go into clinical practice and other things. So I'm not aware of those, which is why I'm talking about this. So RA projects are usually a year long, but they can be 2 or 3 years. And they're also called post-baccalaureate positions in the US. The thing about research assistantships is that you can gain experience in a very different field if you've never had that chance to do it. And a research assistantship is a paid opportunity, and you are a sort of technician in the lab who's contributing to a project. And it's always great because you're interacting with new supervisors and new networks. But if you are an international student, then RA-ships are definitely not very easy to come by for short periods of time. And 1 year may also be too short to achieve anything significant, which of course depends on your model system and on what sort of project you're working on. So you will have to weigh out these things depending on the exact field you're interested in. So I had applied for RA positions after my undergraduate last year because I was looking into backups alongside PhD applications. So the main way to go about these is by cold emailing professors. You find their details and you email them, and you have to be really, really concise and in your cover letters where you explain your ideas for a project. And you also, another great thing you can do is reach out to students in the lab, because by doing this, you can get to know if that person is willing to take students and what sort of openings are available. So make sure you look up lab websites, because increasingly now PIs are advertising things on their website. So one main thing about RA-ships is persistence. Even if you're not getting any sort of replies, some supervisors may reach out later if they manage to gain funding. And this is something that you'll have to keep doing until you hit a positive response. And by positive response, I mean someone who is willing to take you, willing to fund you, and have an official confirmation letter. Because especially if you're not within their geographical region, you'll have to work out a lot of other processes before you can physically go there. So another thing is find new labs and younger supervisors, because they will have received funding recently and are more likely to recruit a one-year project student. And European institutes are usually things I would recommend if you're international, because getting a visa to go to the US for an RA position is completely different as compared to what it is if you're going there for a PhD, which is why I would definitely recommend doing an RA at a European institute. And the way in which you find supervisors is, as I said, look up lab websites, but also university websites sometimes have job boards. At least in the UK, if you look into the major institutes, they definitely have job boards. And one advantage of Twitter is that you can find a lot of advertised positions there. So if you aren't on Twitter yet and you're interested in these things, you can surely join and follow the right network of people. And yeah, asking previous supervisors to refer you is always a really, really good idea, because they know what is needed and they know how much is needed, and they're probably the best way to get ahead. So yeah, I'm done with what I'd like to say, but I really have to emphasize the importance of getting through this, because it is actually really quite hard. If you are not a student at already in any of the Western countries that you want to apply to, it's definitely an uphill climb, but I don't think you need to be constantly in worry about what you're doing right now, what you're not doing. Just make sure what you're doing, you're consistently working on. The main point of your doing research on the brain is your curiosity, your want to understand why something is the way it is. And I'm sure if you keep consistently working on these things, you will definitely make it through. Having said that, I know people who have foreign internships and who've had publications and they've still not made it into graduate programs. And I know people without those who've made it in. So at the end of the day, the only thing you can do is put the best foot forward and let the rest, take over. Because if you have done your best, that's all you need to know. A lot of this is very, very subjective. So I'm going to share, just a minute. I'm going to share a link to a list of resources I had compiled. This has information about summer internships and a lot of other things. So yeah, it's in this document. So you can have a look at these. And I've also included the links to the articles that I had mentioned in my presentation, if you're interested. And thank you very much for listening to me.
Spatika, I think we have one last question, if you're okay with that.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
So Hema's asked, are virtual RA positions available? Also, if one wants to work as a research assistant for just a year before applying to graduate school, what are the chances of getting an RA position?
Yeah, so there are virtual RA positions, but that depends on the field. So if you're doing a computational project, then definitely you can get positions. But again, as I said, RA positions are hard to come by because people who do RAs are not there for a long time. So the PI has to evaluate how useful it is for them. But I think virtual RA positions are more easy to get than physical ones, because you don't have to pay for the student to, physically come there. If you do want to work as an RA before applying, as I said, your chances are, your chances are probably higher if you're applying to a newer PI or if you're applying to an advertised position. I've actually included a link to something called Academic Jobs Online, and that has a lot of advertised positions within universities in the US. That's where I came across a lot of positions for RA. But as I said, especially the US is much harder to get an RA position because it's that much of trouble to get an international student there if you are a national student. But Europe is generally much more welcoming, and you should definitely look at the university website. So the Max Plancks for neurobiology, for animal behavior, all these things have cognition, psychiatry, all of them. Their sites do have advertisements, and look into individual lab websites. If some PI is really open and willing, I'm sure you can work your way through that.
Okay. Thank you so much, Spatika. That was really, really informative. I'm sure everyone agrees with me. Yeah, thank you for your time. And thank you everyone for coming along.
Thanks so much for having me, and thanks a lot for listening.